Hello, everyone. My name is Brooklyn Myers, and I am an Elixir newbie. My goal is to help people adopt Elixir and grow as developers while doing the same myself. I do that by documenting and sharing my own experience in the Elixir industry. It's been an incredible journey so far, and I look forward to taking the next step with you. So, let's jump in to the Elixir Newbie Podcast. Pair programming is the act of collaboratively sitting down with another developer or developers and programming together. And so in this episode of the Elixir Newbie Podcast, I'm going to talk about what pair programming is, why you should consider pair programming, especially if you are an Elixir newbie or a beginner programmer, as well as some ways to pair program better and to avoid some of the pitfalls that come with pair programming. As well as I'm going to talk about, if you're not already pair programming on your team, how can you encourage the adoption of pair programming so that that becomes a practice that is more common on your team. And hopefully after I go through why it's beneficial, that's going to be something that you're going to want to do if you're not already doing it. And so first, I'm just going to go through an overview of what pair programming is. So pair programming is the act of collaboratively sitting down together with one other developer, although it can be many developers, but I'm going to talk primarily about when you're sitting down with one other developer and you're going to work on the same feature together. And so that is the most general way of describing pair programming. But there's a specific way of pair programming that I tend to adopt, and there's probably tons of different ways of pair programming, but I'm going to talk about it from my perspective and how I encourage it and how I do it. And so the way that I pair program is there are two roles primarily. There's the navigator and there's the driver. And the metaphor I think of is you're in a car, you're both headed to the same destination. The navigator is the person in the side seat who is looking at the map and giving out directions and kind of high-level instruction. And then the driver is the one with the wheel. They are making the specific turns and handling all of the implementation details. And so when you take that analogy over to code, the driver is the one who has access to the keyboard. They are concerned about the details of implementation with how they're actually going to write the code. And the navigator is more concerned with higher level design, higher level thinking. They are, if you've ever heard the expression, forest in the trees. So it's a way of thinking about viewing a problem. You can't see the forest for the trees. That's kind of how it tends to be used. And it's this thought that the trees are the individual things that make up the forest. But the forest is more the general abstract idea. And so the navigator is thinking about the forest and the driver is thinking about the individual trees. And so how that plays out is you get the benefit of having someone who can use what I typically refer to as type 2 thinking, which is that kind of background processing. They're really mulling over the problem, thinking about all its minute, intricate details and roadblocks that you might encounter along the way. And one person gets to be very narrow and focused and type 1 thinking, which is they are really focused on solving the specific problem at hand. And by combining those two ways of thinking, you actually get to be more effective than if you were to simply split those developers up. So one of the main benefits of pair programming, even though it's a bit counterintuitive, is that I actually think it makes you go faster. The sum of the parts does not equal the whole. And so in this case, by having those two people come together, you'll sometimes hear the expression 1 + 1 = 3. And so even though you have two developers working together and they are limited by the throughput of the keyboard, the actual constraint to programming is thinking speed, not typing speed. And so by putting those two people together, you're going to be more effective than if you were to split them apart. And that's just the individual one-on-one benefits. That's kind of the pitch that you can give to business types who might not immediately want to encourage pair programming because they're worried that it's going to make the team less effective. It's going to half their resources because, well, now there's not two people typing, so that intuitive idea of two people typing being faster will sometimes not be something that a business type or other developer really is going to latch onto. So that's kind of the primary way that you can explain the value of pair programming beyond some of the obvious stuff. So some of the obvious stuff is you get knowledge sharing. So by having, especially if you're a newer developer, if you get to sit in with a more senior developer and pair program with them, you're going to learn the code base faster. You're going to pick up their skills and their tricks of thinking about code, and you're going to be able to share knowledge on the team. And this can be domain-specific knowledge of learning about the actual application. This can be more general expertise of understanding the methodologies and practices that your other coworkers use. It can also be a way to collaborate on and agree on patterns amongst the team, because as soon as two people work together, they work on a specific area of the code base, they agree on how that should work. Now, when those people split apart and pair with different developers, they can share and spread that understanding of why that part of the code base was written that way. And so it tends to be this way of getting all the developers on your team on the same page about coding practices, disciplines, and patterns without needing to explicitly document them or have meetings about them or waste time talking about them. You kind of get that for free when you pair program. And additionally, you get this enforced sense of discipline when you're pair programming with someone. So if you've ever worked on your own and you're sitting at your computer, sometimes your mind can go off into space. You're not necessarily noticing that you're distracted or not thinking about the problem. Whereas when you're pairing with someone, you're constantly talking about the problem and constantly back and forth. And some people actually find that pair programming can be quite tiring, especially at first, because you are working harder because your brain is more engaged on the problem and you kind of keep each other focused. In addition, you have this feeling of being watched, which is not a bad thing. By feeling watched, you are less likely to take shortcuts or commit code sins or write kind of sloppy code, because you have someone there with you who is going to call you on that, who's going to say, hey, that's not the level of quality that we want. We want to write high quality, well-tested, and maintainable code. Here's the way that we can write that. And so you tend to foster this sense of trusting each other because everyone works with everyone directly. You're no longer having that feeling of, whenever, sorry for picking on the Daves out there. Whenever Dave writes code, I don't like interacting with Dave's code, and gives me this sour sense of Dave, which is probably not fair to Dave. He has, there's no real Dave here, but probably not fair to Dave because he, has very good ideas and reasons for all the code that he's written. I just don't understand them. But, my intuitive reaction as a developer is if I don't understand something, it's probably bad. Obviously, I'm kidding. But you get this sense of fostering collaboration with your other developers because now you get to work with everyone one-on-one. You get to have insight to everyone's skills and ability. You get to help grow each other. And especially in the increasingly remote world, I find that pair programming can make me feel far more connected with my coworkers. And, for example, on my current team, they started off not pair programming. That was something that I really wanted to push. And since pushing it, I've started to feel a lot closer collaboratively with my coworkers. Started to be able to talk with them more because you're spending some time together. You do get some of that natural socialization time that in a remote job is kind of hard to reproduce, that quote unquote water cooler talk where you both get up, you have a break, and then you start chatting with each other. It's a lot hard to reproduce that in a remote setting. And so you get some of that socialization for free when you pair program while still making it very effective and on task to what you're trying to do. Okay, so I've talked about why pair programming is useful. I've talked about knowledge sharing, an enforced sense of discipline. I've talked about thinking speed versus typing speed, how 1 + 1 = 3 when you're thinking about pair programming. I've talked about fostering a sense of collaboration and community on your team, keeping your especially remote teams closer with each other, which can be very hard to do on a remote team. It's very easy to feel isolated in that environment. And some of the primary benefits of pair programming. Now that I've hopefully talked about why pair programming is useful and got you interested in adopting it for yourself and on your team, I'm going to talk about how to pair program well. And for context on my experience with this, I worked on a team previously who pretty much exclusively for all hours of the day pair programmed. And I absolutely loved this team. It was a way for me to grow a lot as a newer developer because I got lots of one-on-one time with more senior and experienced developers. And the time I spent with more junior developers was also very beneficial because now I'm forced to explain parts of the code base. I'm forced to explain different concepts to them, and it really tests your knowledge as a developer to be able to explain concepts that you understand to someone who doesn't. And so there was huge value there. And through that experience, I got to run into some of the stumbling blocks of pair programming. And I got to experience moments where I wasn't doing it as well, or we weren't doing it as well, and got a sense for what is good pair programming and what is not as good pair programming, and when it's most useful and when it's maybe less useful. And so my biggest piece of advice for how to pair program well is to really know the roles as much as possible. So when you're pair programming, really stick to the idea of the driver and navigator roles. And once you're experienced, once you're you have your own ideas about pair programming, of course, you can break out of this model and you can try different ways of doing it. But I found that, especially in the beginning, the restrictions that you want to consider putting on yourself if you're trying to get good at pair programming and have good pair programming sessions is the two rules I try to follow is that the driver will not type unless told, and the navigator is not allowed to type at all. And so really sticking as strict as you can to that will avoid some of the big pitfalls of pair programming. And the reason for that is that where pair programming can go wrong is if either person is taking up more than their role allows. Essentially, you can overdrive or you can over-navigate. And so overdriving looks like one person is typing and talking and deciding what the feature is going to be and how they're going to do it, and the other person is just kind of sitting there. And there's this feeling of not being involved. Why am I even here? Just not feeling like they're a real part of the process. And sometimes that can be, like with everything, this is more of a guidance, a rule of thumb. There are times when you can break this, but this is something to consider sticking to if you're finding that you have pair programming sessions where you're really not feeling involved or you're feeling like the other person isn't involved. And this is especially good if there's a larger skill gap between the developers, because if two equally skilled developers are going through the feature, chances are they're following along, they're understanding what's going on, and so that's when you have a bit more leeway to break outside of the roles. But if you have a larger skill gap, it can be harder for the less experienced person to follow, and generally speaking, the less experienced person is not really going to be involved and not necessarily know what's happening and have to keep checking in, and so that's something to avoid. And when you have a larger skill gap between your devs, the most common pitfall that I see tends to be overdriving, where one person is taking up both roles. Alternatively, if you are sticking to the driver is only going to type, the other pitfall you can fall into is over-navigating. I sometimes refer to it as whip navigating. So the metaphor of driving a car and having another person in the other seat with a map turns into very much a cart, a horse, and a whip. And so you feel like you're a horse and the other person is just whipping at your back, telling you exactly what to do, giving you no time and space to think. And so that's what can happen with the navigator if they aren't careful to give the driver some breathing room and some thinking room. if they're just saying, write this, do this, that can be very frustrating as a driver. And for context, I have absolutely done this. Other people I know have absolutely done this. All of the mistakes that I talk about, I have personally made. It's a normal part of the process. It is part of learning how to pair program well. And particularly, a lot of these things happen because you're extremely excited. And, I tend to get very excited when I'm pair programming with someone and talking them through it. And sometimes I can be a bit too vocal and not give them space to think and consider the code base. And that's why I've fallen into some of these pitfalls. So keeping these things in mind and knowing that they're potential mistakes you can make will hopefully help you navigate that situation and know when you should maybe take your foot off the gas and give the other person some space, or when you should have them take more of a role, because a very common problem is, as the more senior person, the more junior person is going to not get involved as much. And so if you're having that problem, really enforce the role of making it so that if you're driving, you won't start typing unless the navigator tells you to do something. And if you're navigating, you're not going to just grab the keyboard and type. So that'll help you restrict yourself so that you don't potentially take away their agency. And of course, there are exceptions to these rules. They're more like guidelines than rules. Early on, I really do advocate that you stick to them pretty much to the letter. But as you get more experience and you feel more comfortable breaking them, there are certainly times when, as the navigator, it's perfectly fine to grab the keyboard. Particularly, I find as navigator, it's useful when you're trying to explain a concept to your driver and they're just not understanding through words and you're not effectively communicating the idea. Sometimes you just need to show it in code. And so those are moments when the navigator can quickly switch over, become the driver for a second, and show some code to help the driver understand what they're trying to communicate. And vice versa, as the driver, communication in pair programming is always free. Both roles are allowed to communicate completely freely, ask questions, talk, state their opinion. There's no restrictions on communication. The restrictions are purely on the keyboard. Those are the only things that I really consider as rules. So as the driver, if you have an opinion about the direction that the navigator is providing, if they're saying, hey, I think we should write it this way, you as the driver are absolutely allowed to say, actually, I think this would be a better approach. Or what do you think about this? And state your opinion and have a conversation about it. And through that process of communicating with each other, you're going to wind up with a higher quality solution. And remember that as the driver, if your navigator tells you go left, you have control over the keyboard. And so as much as you don't type anything unless the navigator tells you to, you also don't have to type what the navigator tells you to. Now, I'm not just trying to say that in a contentious way. It's not in a argumentative, fighting with each other kind of a way. But at the end of the day, you're the one with the keyboard. And so you act as this barrier to the code. And so you need to talk and agree on the direction, or at least agree to try a direction before any code's actually going to be written, and staying on the same page. And sometimes you'll have these moments where either your navigator or the driver feels really strongly about one direction and the other person feels very strongly about a totally different direction. And this breaks down to figuring out how to communicate with people and come to a shared understanding. Oftentimes I find in those moments it's best to accept the other person's direction if you don't understand it. So if you really understand it and you have strong reasons why you don't want to go that way, then try to share and talk and collaborate. But if they're just sharing a different way of doing things and it's not the way that you normally would, that's one of the primary benefits of pair programming, is you get to see different ways of thinking about code. And so if that's the case, what you really want to do is try to give them the ability to show you what they mean, follow them down the path, even if you don't quite know where it's going to end up, because chances are both of you are going to learn something that way. And so try to be willing to accept different ways of writing code than you might normally do. And my, I think last tip before I go into how to add pair programming on your team is how to be an effective navigator. So if you're the driver, we've already talked about basically you're worrying about the implementation details. The navigator is going to give you some kind of instruction on where you think you should go. You can give your opinion, your feedback, your 2 cents on whatever's happening, and you come to a shared understanding through communication on what you should be writing, and then you focus on the details of actually making that code happen. As the navigator, what you want to do is provide instruction to the driver with increasing levels of specificity depending on what's necessary. So you can imagine, this is going back to that driving with a map analogy. You have, you're the passenger and they're the driver. If you're in an area that the driver's very familiar with, you might be able to say, oh, just go take the bridge, or, oh, just head north. And the driver knows what to do, and they're going to go through all the routes, and they can handle it. So you can provide this pretty high level of instruction, even though there's lots of individual steps along the way. So in the code base, you might say, oh, let's go and add this to the code, or let's add in this feature. And the driver might immediately know, yep, I totally understand what we need to do to that. Here's what I think we should do. But if they don't, particularly if you're working with someone who's more junior, you often have to get more specific with your level of instruction. And it's good to remember to start very high so that you get them thinking about it. And depending on their experience with that specific part of the code base or their general experience, then making it more and more and more specific, all the way down to telling people to type in specific letters. If I were pair programming with someone who had never written code before, the way I would navigate is by telling them, okay, now type for, so FOR, and really walking them through all of the low-level constructs in the code. Whereas if you're working with someone who has programming experience, obviously you don't need to do that. You can just say, let's iterate over this collection, and you don't need to say what code constructs you're going to use to do that. They're familiar enough with the programming language that you're using to be able to just write it with that level of instruction. And so keeping in mind who you are pair programming with so that you're not going too specific, because with a more experienced developer, if you tell them all the nitty-gritty implementation details that they need to do, frankly, you're leaning on over navigating or whipping, being a whip navigator and making them feel like they have no agency. So don't be too specific, particularly with a senior developer, but be more specific, particularly with a more junior developer. And start high and then narrow your way down to be more specific and more specific as it's necessary. And you'll kind of get a feel for what level of instruction is good for whoever you're working with. And you get a sense of how to do that effectively without stepping on anyone's toes, or the last thing you want to do is come across as condescending and tell your very experienced developer how to do a enum.map. It's like, yes, I know how to do an enum.map. Thank you. So yeah, that's how you can think about delivering instruction as a navigator. Okay, so hopefully I have convinced you the benefits of pair programming and why you want to put pair programming onto your team. But let's say you're working in a development environment where pair programming is not already a day-to-day occurrence. So if that's the case, easy peasy, you already have people you can pair program with, just go and do it and you're going to be great. But if you're on a team who haven't really done that before and aren't necessarily convinced of its effectiveness, how do you start a practice of pair programming? And so this is something I was faced on my current team. They were very open to the idea of pair programming when I started to talk about it. And so sometimes you'll have teams who are really closed off to the idea, and that's a very different situation. Sometimes you'll have teams who are extremely open to the idea. They just haven't done it or aren't fully comfortable with how it works yet. And so those are two very different cases, and you can handle them differently, although a lot of the strategies for making it a practice on your team are going to be common to both. And so my first recommendation, if you're trying to get pair programming to be a thing on your team, is don't start by convincing your team. Start by convincing one person. Find one person on your team who you think would be open to the idea, open to trying it, and find an opportunity where you and them can sit down for a small pair programming session, ideally on a feature that you think is going to highlight the benefits of it. And I did that when I first started with my current team. where I found one of the more junior members, and I had recently reviewed one of their PRs and said that I wanted to see more testing on their feature because the primary path wasn't particularly tested. And so I offered to pair program with them. I said, hey, let's take this as an opportunity to pair program. I can show you how I would write these tests, what my approach would be, and we can go through that together so that we can, feed off of each other's ideas. And that was great. That was a great opportunity to pair program. And now there's this person who's seen the direct impact. And now it's not just you saying, man, pair programming is so useful. Pair programming becomes something that everyone that you do it with, hopefully, will have good things to say about it. And it's much easier. You don't convince a team, you just convince a collection of individuals. You convince every single person on that team that pair programming is good, and then suddenly you have a practice of pair programming. And if you're doing that, pretty much any time you're pushing a new idea, a new pattern, a new whatever it is that you want to have happen on your team, you want to try to be the resident expert and be the person that anyone can go to, and you're going to help them learn about what it is that you're trying to add. Sometimes I'll consider, hey, is this framework right for this project, or adding in a new tool? And if I'm going to do that, you don't want to just put in the tool and then walk away. That'll leave other people feeling very frustrated every time they have to work with that piece of code. The same goes for pair programming. If you start trying to get people into pair programming, but then don't help anyone learn how to do it, or create opportunities where you can, or make it clear that, hey, if anyone wants to pair program with me, I'm always happy to. And you need to be the person who's driving it. Now, if you're on a team who's already doing it, or if you don't want to be that person who's driving it, you can maybe try to find a team that is interested in that. Sometimes it is not possible to change a team's dynamic. So consider if that's something that you want to do, because anytime that a team's culture doesn't quite match what you're looking for, there's of course time and effort that goes into converting it into the kind of culture that you do want it to be. And so every team is going to be different and not have the exact same practices. And so there's always going to be things that you're going to want to push on the teams that you join and recommend, and see if it's a good fit. The question is, does the team have the things that you find really important, and do you think they would be open to adopting them? So if you're on a team and pair program, there's just not a single person who's interested in it, and it's something that you really, really want to do, that's the kind of thing that you may consider finding a different team for if pushing it on the team just isn't working. Okay, so you're in this situation again. You've managed to convince a few people that pair programming is useful. Hopefully those people have mentioned it to the leaders in the team and talked about their positive experience, and now the effort to put pair programming on the team is not just something that you're pushing and everyone else is resisting. Now you hopefully have a few people who are on board with it, who think it's a cool idea, who want to talk about it on more of a group level. And so that's the point at which you start to consider, can you get the leaders of the team on board? And so you might have spoken with some other leaders on the team about pair programming and about the idea of it, kind of run it past them, gotten their ideas less as a, hey, I really want to do pair programming, let's push it, and more, hey, I really love this thing called pair programming. Have you ever done it before? What do you think about it? And getting their ideas. So I did that on my current team, and I was fortunate that leadership was really on board with the idea. They just wanted to see that it had value and that it would benefit the team. And I think their primary concern was is this going to slow us down? There were probably other concerns, but I think that was the number one concern of, well, we don't want to have people do this all day because then they won't have time to be effective, or you know what, there's tasks where pair programming isn't a good fit. And so in those conversations, I've really had to stress the impact of sharing knowledge on the team of, honestly, you can save hours of time, because as you're working on a feature and you're exploring a new area of the code base, if your pair partner knows about that area, they'll share that knowledge with you, and you won't even realize that they just saved you an hour and a half just by telling you how it works and explaining things. And so you get tons of efficiency benefits to pair programming, and you also make everyone on the team better programmers, which of course is a multiplying effect where now your entire team is faster. And so knowing the arguments for why pair programming is beneficial and being able to communicate that to the leaders on your team will help them get on board so that pair programming doesn't become something that they resent that you're doing, even though all the developers love it. It becomes something that they are on board with, and they're also at least willing to try it, maybe not fully convinced because they need to see results, but they are open to you trying it with more people, taking up more time pair programming, and trying to make it more of a thing. And by doing that, by spending your time pair programming, by working with other developers and getting them interested in it, you will hopefully foster a spirit where everyone on the team wants to do it. And then now it's become part of the culture, and that's the place that you want to get to. So starting small, convincing one person, and it doesn't matter if there is resistance from your entire team. If you can just convince one person to try pair programming with you and then give them a good experience of doing it, then they will now be an advocate for it. And do that with as many people as you can. If you're on a small team, this is obviously much easier to get the entire team on board. If you're on a larger team, you might create small pockets of people who are willing to pair program with you, and you don't necessarily need to make this something that absolutely everyone does. Although from a leadership perspective, I think the benefits of pair programming are so worth it that you definitely should consider having it be common practice for your entire team. Like I said, I worked on a team where that was the culture. Everyone pair programmed with each other every single day. And I've never been on a team that, the quality of developers because of that, the amount of trust of each other, the sense of collaboration was so strong because you spent every day working with each other. And that is, to me, such a positive that now it's become something that any team that I join, that's something that I really want to push if it's not there. And of course, there's lots of things I love. There's not always, it's not always the right fit for a team, or it's not always the right thing to start pushing because, you have lots of things that you want to do when you join a new team, and you want to try to, at least I'm the type of person, I want to try to add to the culture if I can. Pair programming is one of those things that it's my number one. Maybe testing and pair programming. Those are the two things that I personally try to really push whenever I join a team. If those things aren't already there, those will be the two things that I'm the most vocal about. And then everything else is just kind of a nice to have. But getting good testing and getting good, fostering a spirit of pair programming where I have people who I can pair program with, that to me is really critical and would definitely be enough to make me leave a team if it wasn't something that I felt like there was a chance. So if you're struggling to get pair programming working on your team, if you've tried all of the tips that I've recommended and it's still just not working out, sometimes the effort to change is just so high that you might be better off looking for pair programming elsewhere, if that's something that's important to you. If it's not as important to you, then that's totally understandable. But if it's really something that you decide to want and you're not going to be able to do it at your current team, then that can be tough. That can be something to leave for. If you're a junior and you're not already pair programming, I've kind of talked about pair programming from the more intermediate perspective where I have pair programmed a lot. Obviously, it's harder to guarantee a good experience pair programming if it's also new to you. So if you can find a team who, this is one of the questions I'll always ask whenever doing an interview is, do you pair program? If you're a new developer and you have the ability to be picky, because not everyone does for when they're looking for the first job, of course, but if you have the ability to be picky and if pair program is on the table, that is 100% one of the things that I would recommend you find a team that does, because you're going to grow so much faster by being able to have one-on-one dev time with more experienced developers. And I've found that really improves the speed of onboarding. And that's great from the senior perspective, where whenever we hire a less experienced developer, now they are onboarding much faster. But it's also great from the new developer's perspective, where if you want to get into the industry and you want to hit the ground running, if you find a team that does pair programming, you're going to learn a lot faster. So definitely look out for that. Okay, so that is pretty much it for this episode and pretty much it for pair programming. If you have any questions about pair programming or anything Elixir or tech related, you can always ask me on Twitter. I'm at Brooklyn J. Myers. And if you want to pair program sometime and you're looking for tips on how to do that, or you want to give it a shot sometime, feel free to reach out to me. I'm always happy to spend time talking with folks about technology. And I'm very excited about pair programming. So if I can ever help anyone out with that, feel free. You're always welcome to reach out. Alrighty, well, I hope you have an excellent rest of your week, and I will catch you on the next episode.